Alaska is the biggest state in the USA by a significant margin, but only by pure landmass, because despite its vast size and equally vast supply of natural resources, the state is the third smallest economy within the Union with an estimated GDP of only $68 billion. Of course, a lot of that is simply down to geography. Alaska may be vast, but most of its landmass is relatively inhospitable to human life, let alone major industries, so its population is also tiny. That, combined with its remote location, means that the only industries that have developed there are those that need to be there. From the fur industry to Arctic fishing, oil extraction, and even modern tourism, most of Alaska's economic activity has typically relied on pulling value out of the region and shipping it back to places that don't have the same resources, but are more agreeable to human life. Now, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, and as an Australian I'm not one to talk, but this whole system only really works if there is something of value to be extracted from this remote location. Typically, this has been oil, a globally demanded and easily transportable natural resource, but Alaska is running out of the stuff. Its oil production peaked decades ago, and it's been declining ever since. Now, the state has made some interesting investments into its future to combat this inevitability, and those investments are worth exploring individually, but even still, the reality is that while the USA as a whole has experienced incredibly strong growth in recent decades, Alaska has been stagnant, and accounting for inflation, which has hit the state particularly hard, it's actually gone backwards. This is an interesting problem because a lot of Alaska's economy behaves very differently to the rest of the country, and beyond that, it's an increasingly important military and logistics hub, which could be the key to reinvigorating the state. So, how did Alaska become the state it is today? What is really behind its current challenges? And finally, why will it never be allowed to get too bad? Once we've done all of that, we can put Alaska on the Economics Explained leaderboard to see how it stacks up against other US states and entire national economies. Every day, countless bits of your personal information have been collected and sold online without your knowledge. You wouldn't believe just how much data about you is bought and sold every day. Names, addresses, emails, login credentials, and much more. This is not just surprising, but also quite serious. It leaves you exposed to everything from annoying spam to serious risks like identity theft. Luckily, there is a solution to this problem, and that is our sponsor, Incogni. All you need to do is grant them the right to work for you, and they'll do the rest. After I got started with them, Incogni found 89 places on the internet where my data was being sold online, and within an hour of setting it up, Incogni had removed 26 of them, and was dealing with more. You don't need to do anything yourself. Incogni contacts and removes you from lists online so you can drastically reduce your chance of cybercriminals stealing your data. So, try Incogni now and use our code ECONOMICS at the link in the description and get 60% off an annual plan. Alaska is one of those regions that, due to its location, has held an increasingly volatile position in the realm of international trade and defence. Originally, Russia acquired it for two primary purposes. The first was that they were eager to spread Orthodox Christianity to the New World. Missionary work was prevalent in both the West and the East, and then secondly, upon the discovery of furs, many hunters were encouraged to set sail to establish a trade network there. This by no means was the start of a major settlement though. Conditions were harsh, and even at its peak, less than 1,000 people, almost entirely men there to seek work, made a home in the Alaskan wilderness. Agrarian difficulties in the north didn't help either. The growth was slow, and much of the initial success the Russians experienced with the Alaskan territory was due to expanding their network by placing another settlement in California to establish trade with the Spaniards. Of course, in perhaps one of the greatest land sale blunders, the Russian Tsar sold the Alaskan land, about 370 million acres, to the US in the late 19th century for $7.2 million. According to most references, this possibly amounts to around $113 million today. But as a quick side note, adjusting for inflation from that long ago is very hard because there were different currencies, different countries, and most importantly, radically different pricing indexes between then and now. For example, we don't really care about the price of whale oil these days, but back then it was a major household item, so comparing inflation between two different time periods that far apart is very difficult, even assuming that countries back then measured their economies as meticulously as we do today, which of course they did not. For anti-side tangent over, even without an exact number, everyone agrees that this sale was a massive lost opportunity for Russia and a seemingly endless gain for the United States. Aside from fishing, timber, lead, zinc, copper, platinum and gold found within its borders, the discovery of oil in the Kenai Peninsula proved that the land was going to be a lasting and secure economic base for the US in the coming decades. On January 3, 1959, Alaska officially became a US state, and by 1968, Alaska was a significant oil producer, and the industry was contributing more than 20% of the total revenue to the state's treasury. In 1969, $900 million in bids for oil tracts signalled the beginning of the Black Gold Rush. This was a welcome growth industry because even with modern infrastructure, the region is inhospitable to most activity. First off, it lacks fertile ground, and the state has quite a bit of trouble with this particular obstacle. It's a territory that struggles with short growing seasons, fairly cool summers, and brutal winters. As a result, the agricultural industry in Alaska is small, producing primarily cold-hardy crops like hay, barley, potatoes, carrots, and kale. Alaska is twice the size of Texas, but has the third smallest population of all US states. And even with a small, dwindling population, the state isn't able to feed itself. Approximately 95% of the food residents consume is imported. The population is also so small that setting up large big box stores has been slow, so prices remain high. Groceries are around 30% higher than the rest of the country, and the same percentage can be applied to clothing and most other essentials as well. Beyond basic necessities, the cost of living in Alaska is 30% higher than the national average. Basic services like utilities alone are 49% higher than the national average, again due to the small scale and remote location of these operations. In an effort to incentivise residency, Alaska has a number of financial support plans, the most notable being the Alaska Future Fund, a $100 million program that invests in businesses and projects that support core sectors of the Alaskan economy, including but not limited to natural resources, transportation and infrastructure, to grow the Alaskan economy and foster the next generation of private market opportunities in the state. That is the hope anyway. It is a major financial resource, but it's only a small component of a much larger financial apparatus that Alaska has set up for itself. The Future Fund is just one component of the Alaska Permanent Fund, which was created by the Alaskan government in 1950. It's the largest and one of the oldest sovereign wealth funds in the United States. Alaska has massive oil reserves that continue to bring in billions of dollars of tax revenue. A portion of this revenue, as well as the revenue garnered from other mining projects, is deposited each year and invested into a diversified portfolio to contribute to the growth of the fund. And as a result, the Permanent Fund has grown to over $64 billion in size. Unlike most major sovereign wealth funds around the world, earnings from this investment pool are paid out directly to Alaskan citizens. These payments typically range from $1,000 to $2,000 per person every year. For 2021, the dividend was $1,114, meaning that a family of four would receive $4,456. Of course, this has been beneficial for Alaskan natives, but it still doesn't even come close to offsetting the increased living costs. And that has given the state a sustainability problem. A lot of the industries only exist there because they are dependent on the resources of Alaska itself. Oil is the obvious one, but there are other arguably even more essential industries that can only be conducted in Alaska thanks to its unique global position. With over 3 million lakes, 12,000 rivers, 6,640 miles of coastline, and 47,300 miles of estimated tidal shoreline, Alaska is the seafood pantry of the United States, and even that is a bit of an understatement. In 2021 and 2022, Alaska was responsible for producing more seafood than every other state and territory in the USA combined. Additionally, if Alaska was its own independent nation, this single state would rank number 9 on the list of global wild seafood producers. Chief amongst these seafood products are salmon and crab, both separately accounting for 9% of the global market. But the fishing industry isn't the only thing attracted to Alaska's remote location. Back in 1935, General Billy Mitchell went on to say during a testimony before Congress that Alaska is the most strategic place on Earth. Because Alaska sits along the Bering Strait between the Pacific and Arctic Oceans, it serves as a choke point, giving the US an insane amount of leverage in the Great Circle routes between North America and East Asia. Its unique location is actually the closest centre to a lot of major global cities, so it's become a popular hub for air cargo, as well as a centre for military operations. The Great Circle routes cannot be understated, as they dramatically shorten the shipping distance between these two major continents. Global rivals like China and Russia are also considering this passage increasingly vital for economic stability. Russia specifically has made efforts directly to increase this value, creating a fairly large icebreaker fleet for easy transit, and even establishing a toll system for those eager to take advantage of such a novel service. Although, of course, for now this service has slowed down significantly in the wake of global sanctions. What makes this fascinating is that the Northwest Passage was basically just a legend for much of recorded history, with many expeditions resulting in cataclysmic failure. A fun little side note is that a ghost ship named the HMS Resolute, found later after a lost expedition through the passage, was carved up with some materials being used to make an Oval Office desk for President Rutherford B. Hayes as a present from Queen Victoria. But with major technological advancements in ship design and a little bit of help from melting ice caps, regular shipping and travel is now possible during warmer months. And with an increase of accessibility, tensions amongst nations bordering the Atlantic have begun to rise, and with it, renewed interest in national security investments in Alaska. Just this year, the US government made moves to support major projects in the state with the approval of the National Defense Authorization Act, or NDAA. The $923 billion legislation includes 34 provisions that authorize more than $790 million in military construction for Alaska. In fact, this has become such an important priority for the US that military and civilian logistics operations are actually now a larger value-added industry than natural resource extraction. Any other industries that exist in Alaska are really only there to provide goods and services to those working in oil, fishing, or logistics. Now, while those industries bring in a lot of money, they also contribute to one of the state's biggest economic features, its transient population. In 2018, there were 406,547 total workers employed in Alaska at some point. Of these, 84,238, almost 21%, were non-resident workers. The largest number of these in-and-out workers filled seafood processing and tourism positions that are difficult to fill with residents during the busy summer. Now, on an individual level, this represents a number of very lucrative opportunities for college students, foreigners, and men from the mainland. Men being the operative word. In urban areas like Anchorage, the male-to-female ratio is almost even. But in commercial regions, the ratio is over 180 men for every 100 women. Many note that this is becoming a lot more balanced in recent years, though. This can partially be attributed to the drop in oil production and other occupations that Alaska was renowned for. That aside, this doesn't negate the fact that a lot of people move to Alaska temporarily to work in these industries before ultimately going back home taking their wealth with them, making the state in many ways more of a remote work site than a regular economy. In other words, Alaska isn't self-sustainable as its own entity, and with a stagnating local economy, it's becoming harder and harder for locals who want to make a life in Alaska to compete financially with the fly-in workers who are just there to collect a paycheck and leave. So what does this mean for the state's future? Of course, nobody can predict the future, least of all economists, but there are significant developments worth noting that will affect Alaska and the way it's utilised both domestically and abroad. Organisations like the EPA have highlighted that there are changes in the Alaskan climate. Over the last 60 years, a majority of the state has experienced a rise in temperatures, with an annual increase of over 3 freedom degrees on average, and 6 degrees during the winter. The economic consequences outlined by these experts include an increase in infrastructure maintenance and a major hit to fishing, which is, again, the third largest industry in the state. But these changes, from an exclusively economic standpoint, can also be a potential advantage depending on how they're handled. Temperatures in the state have increased far faster than in most parts of the world, which means beyond just being an air logistics hub, it could be an ocean shipping hub as well, because if the Arctic melts, there will be sea routes across the top of the world between major northern economic centres. The rising temperatures could also to some extent put an end to the agrarian limits Alaska has had in its past. For most of its history, farming was severely limited because of the extreme cold. But with a more hospitable climate for agriculture, this could be a valuable source of revenue to combat the loss of other industries. These cases are all theoretical. What's not is that Alaska won't be allowed to get too bad. Being part of a federation like the United States can have major benefits. It's a massive umbrella providing a significant amount of funding towards the maintenance of programs and services like income security, education, and infrastructure. $1.3 trillion in federal grants was given to state and local governments in 2022 alone. In other words, if one of its member states is struggling, there are mechanisms to help it out, especially if that state is so strategically important to the system as a whole. And with the crisis unfolding across Eastern Europe, the flow of federal funds into Alaska won't be dropping anytime soon. Of course, that's great for the state as a whole, but it may not be as good for the residents and newcomers who need to continue to live in this very expensive area with a shifting jobs landscape. Unemployment amongst locals has been a consistent issue, as a lot of jobs just go to seasonal workers who can find work elsewhere in the off months. When compared to the rest of the US's state unemployment rates, Alaska ranks as the third worst in the nation, only falling behind New York and California. Regardless of the support it may receive from the US as a whole, an isolated economy so dependent on such a small handful of industries is always going to have a level of instability that may not show up in headline economic output figures, but will certainly be felt by people trying to make what most see as an industrial outpost into their home. Okay, now it's time to put Alaska on the Economics Explained leaderboard to see how it stacks up against other US states and entire national economies. Alaska has a GDP of just under $68 billion, which makes it a small state by US standards, only behind Wyoming and Vermont. But the economy of the US is simply massive by global standards. If Alaska was its own country, it would be home to around the 85th largest economy in the world, in line with Slovenia and Belarus. Even still, it gets a 5 out of 10. That output is spread out over a shrinking population of just 733,000 people, meaning it has a per capita GDP of just over $92,000. Now that is an incredible number, which is more than $10,000 higher than the national average of the US, which is itself very high by global standards. But it needs to be taken with a grain of salt. A lot of economic output is created by people who don't live in the state full time, so while they drive up production figures, they don't drive up population counts, meaning that the actual situation for most Alaskan residents is less prosperous than these numbers might suggest. Even still, by nominal figures alone, it can only get a 9 out of 10. Stability and confidence is, as per usual, helped massively by being a US state, and a strategically important one at that. No matter how bad things get, the US has systems that automatically provide support to individual states. Even still, with an over-reliance on just a small handful of industries and genuinely serious problems with affordability, it gets an 8 out of 10. Growth has been mostly stagnant, which is not unusual for advanced economies around the world over the last decade, but is unusual for a US state since the country as a whole has grown massively in the same time. A shrinking natural resource sector and a shrinking population means that it's hit an upper limit on what it can produce until the dynamics of the state radically change. It gets a 5 out of 10 because it's still growing, just not very quickly. Finally, industry. The shrinking oil industry has been mostly offset by tourism, fishing, and logistics, but that's an offset. And Alaska is the least economically complex state in the USA. It still gets a 7 out of 10 because those industries are still highly value-adding in their own right, they just don't quite have the same scale as the rest of the US. Altogether, that gives Alaska an average score of 6.8 out of 10, putting it into equal last place on the state leaderboard so far, but still up here on the national leaderboard. If you want to see how California topped this list, even with its own very long list of real problems, you should be able to click that video on your screen now. Thanks for watching, mate. Bye.